Welcome back to Time to Wild. This is episode 3, and I'm out of dishes. In today's episode, we will be talking about invasive species. To start off, what is an invasive species? So, there's a couple of terms that are thrown around in these conversations, like native, non-native, a pest. What do these even mean? So a native organism is one that you classify as being originating from the ecosystem that you're talking about. Therefore, they are well established and don't cause any harm to the environment. On the other hand, non-native non-native organisms are ones that are not native to the ecosystem, which are introduced by human actions. So these species may or may not cause harm to the environment. Now, invasive is a very threatening term, which very well coincides with the impact that these species do. It is yet again, a non-native organism that is introduced to an ecosystem through human activity. These type of organisms are very, very harmful to the environment and its natural state because of varied reasons. Today we will be exploring a couple of Florida's own invasive species, and at the end I'll talk about one that you might be surprised about. So in Florida's ecosystems, a pretty well-known invasive species is, as you might guess, the Burmese python. So this is a type of snake that was introduced at one point into the Everglades. And the reason why the Burmese python, and realistically invasive species in general, are super harmful to the environment, or to its environment, is because if a species which comes from a harsh environment is introduced to a less harsh environment, it is going to be able to thrive like it was never meant to. Hence, the Burmese python being introduced to the Everglades has been able to just go out of control. So they go from a harsh environment to a less harsh one, which is one of the ways which these organisms are able to thrive. Another one is if they're introduced to a similar ecosystem that is not adapted to have a predator like this. Hence, the Burmese python is unchecked at the ecosystem of the Everglades. There is no real threat to it, as the Everglades hasn't seen a predator like this ever. The Everglades apex predator is the alligator, but it's not going to go out of its way to eat a snake. So the Burmese python are able to thrive at the Everglades, very much causing chaos within it, as they are so hugely unchecked. Again, they're able to just eat through all the mammals more specifically, that are in the Everglades. Think of raccoons. They're powerless against the Burmese python. So it is very harsh to see something like this, and you can understand the threat of invasive species. Another one that we're very common with are green iguanas, which, if you have not heard, green iguanas are actually invasive to Florida, which seems a little strange. You might think of them as a Florida native, but they are not. They cause major harm to not only animals and the ecosystem, but ourselves, as we are very much part of the ecosystem. However, it is an interesting way to know of how we are harmed. One of the ways is during the cold times here in Florida, green iguanas being hot-blooded, they can't regulate their own internal temperature. Therefore, when these cold fronts come in and green iguanas are on the branches of trees or anything like that, and they can't regulate themselves, their temperature, they just pass out, or they might even actually die. Which, as if you're suspended on a tree branch, that means you flop over and you might possibly hit something. So green iguanas are actually super harmful, or it's something you should be very careful of during these colder times if you are in an area where it suffers from a lot. So another way that green iguanas are actually interestingly harmful is they are a burrowing species, meaning that they like to create their own underground kind of burrow where they live and are able to be safe from predators. And the thing is, there being so many, they actually start going underground houses. And if you know anything about Florida infrastructure, specifically housing infrastructure, there's nothing good below the ground. It's only water, meaning that if you're starting to dig underground foundations of houses, this causing major issues for a lot of people on a yearly basis, which is yet again another thing that we should be aware of, that we're not safe from the consequences of these invasive species. And so it brings me to my third invasive species here in Florida, which is a fish. And you might not very much think of this fish as invasive, or fishes in general as invasive. However, the lionfish is an invasive threat, an invasive species to Florida's coral reef life. So the lionfish is a type of fish. When you look at it, it has these very big kind of spikes throughout its body, and those are actually venomous. And yet again, it is an introduction of a species that is unchecked, something that is not capable of being regulated by the natural ecosystem, because nothing in a coral reef is prepared to eat something like this, at least not in our Florida ecosystems or coral reefs. From then, it's able to populate because it's just able to eat whatever it wants without being threatened by anything. So it goes into the coral reefs and searches through all of these corals, eating all the fish and even destroying some of the coral, which is so harmful to the fragile ecosystem that coral reefs have been observed to be in recent times. With climate change and the warming of waters, coral reefs have been very susceptible to bleaching and all sort of changes where they might not be able to thrive. So introducing something like this, yet again, not helping by any means. Another Florida invasive species is actually the Australian pine tree, which is right behind me. So this pine tree, which you actually see everywhere in Florida, is invasive. It is the Australian pine tree, as I have mentioned. And if you could take a guess at what its consequences are or what its effects are, I'll let you take a second, think about it. Okay. So the Australian pine tree is actually competing with mangroves. That's such a bad thing. I briefly talked about mangroves in our last episode, where I talked about some of the importance of why we need mangroves. And you might start to understand that if we don't have mangroves, we might not have land by like 2050, because if these trees start outcompeting the mangroves, there will be no natural protection from erosion on the Florida shores. We might not have houses on land by 2050 in Florida, which is something crazy to think about. Going into my last example of an invasive species, I'm gonna go and zoom out a little bit beyond Florida. And I want you to think about, what is one of the most invasive species in the world? And I'll give you another second, like last time. One of the most invasive species to every continent other than Antarctica are cats. Cats are super, super invasive. And as to why, is because these cats are roaming about anywhere that they can. They're such opportunistic predators that they will be able to find anything to eat, to kill and eat. So think about all the birds, all the rodents, all the small mammals that are just living their life, and because of a stray cat, they are not part of the ecosystem anymore. And I'll give you an example to understand how a real world example of how crazy and destructive cats can be. There was a island in New Zealand which was isolated from human contact for however long it's been there. So the evolution of all the species within that island were so vastly different than from anything that we could have founded on land. And there was a particular species of bird which had actually become flightless. So a flightless bird was found on the island. And I believe a boatman had taken some sort of relocation to this island, or after they found it, they were able to establish some sort of headquarters for him. And this man brought a cat, and the cat was free to roam all over the island. And within a couple of months, the cat was able to make this flightless type of bird extinct. There were no more in the island, never to be seen of ever again. In a couple of months, for one cat to be able to do that, it's insane. So this is just a timely example of what can happen for the long term if these types of invasive species are not checked. Thank you very much for watching today's episode. My name is Mauro Deches. Thank you for watching Time to Wild, and I hope you have a good one.